So the intention of this discussion is to go through 3 case examples that illustrate various standards, but also design review. And we picked 3 that were sort of unique in their own aspects, and some of the panelists are familiar with some of these. Some of the panelists may not be familiar with all of the projects, but they're going to look at it just as you would as a reviewer, or say somebody on a commission, somebody who's evaluating these projects based on their criteria and their conformance to the Secretary standards and also design. So with that being said, I think we're going to turn it over to the first one, and I'm going to give the remote over here to Christy, and she can, I'll give you my mic, or he can give you his, whatever.
Hi, everyone. My name's Christine Nguyen. I'm the Historic Preservation Planner for the City of Anaheim. And today I'm just going to show you a little bit about a project that I am currently working on. So is Jennifer over in Anaheim, called the Anaheim White House Restaurant. Is anyone here familiar with that building? Oh, okay, great. So a few of you. So the building, it was built in 1909 as a single family residence, and it was added to the National Register in 1982. It was converted into a restaurant in 1980. A few things to note about the features. Which one is the pointer? Okay. If you notice, it had an open porte cochere and balconies on the second floor, and an open porch. So today, like I said, it was converted into a restaurant. And a couple owners ago, some unoriginal features were added to the house. A second row of balustrade on the top porch, and then the first story porch was also enclosed. You can't really see it in these pictures, but the first story porte cochere was also enclosed, as well as the second story balcony up here. Here's an aerial view. The building is located off Anaheim Boulevard, very close to the 5 freeway. And another addition is this front building is a banquet hall. And in the back, there's a kitchen addition. So this past February, there was a large fire in the building. Fortunately, it was pretty late at night, and no one was in the building, so no one was injured. The fire department actually responded very quickly to it, so that did help minimize some of the damage, but it was still pretty extensive. Most of the damage occurred in that southwest wing of the building, and you can see this is right after the fire, just some of that char and debris that occurred in the building. This is a kind of a before and after photo to show some of that damage. Jennifer and I were able to take a tour of the interior not too long after the fire, and the exterior photos, actually the interior was actually far worse. When you looked at the interior, just everything was damaged by some sort of smoke damage or just the extreme heat. You could see things that had just melted off the walls. So we have been working with the owner to talk to them about how they want to rebuild. So the owner has met with us on a number of occasions and wants to rebuild the house. A lot of the features that were done to the building were done before he purchased the restaurant. So we've also had multiple conversations about, when we do rebuild, what do we want to rebuild it to? What does the owner want to rebuild it to? Does he want to rebuild to those original photos, or does he want to rebuild to what the restaurant looked like before the fire? So one of the first steps we did was Jennifer, myself, and a couple other people from the City of Anaheim team and Jennifer's colleague, who is a conservator. We met with the owner out at the site and evaluated the condition of the property, looked at the damage that was done by the fire, and then also took note of the character defining features of the property. From that, these are just some other photos, taking a look at the damage and at what could be repaired, what should be replaced, what should be salvaged. From that, Jennifer and her colleague Sarah prepared a report for the city on recommendations for how we felt that the building should be rehabilitated to the Secretary of Interior standards. And it was a very thorough and helpful report that we passed along to the owner. Who, I should say that the building was actually is also under the Mills Act. So they do have some requirements as far as what they need to do and maintain to keep under that contract. But things I wanted to note on in the assessment, what I found the most helpful, and I think was the most helpful for the owner who isn't very familiar with the Secretary of Interior standards and what that means, was providing these images and diagrams and actually pointing out what the character defining features are and how to maintain them. They also included a lot of really helpful photos. So when we talk about, what an appropriate enclosure on top of the porch share would be, instead of having this sort of shed-like structure, if you wanted to have seating up there that's enclosed, what else could you have up there? Something that's a little bit more see-through, like glass, or even an open-air structure that would provide, more of a roof, but not entirely enclosed. So just some different options for the owner and just ways to show him what he could do with the building that would be historically appropriate, but would also be usable for him. And I think another big question that came to mind when evaluating the building is how to be sensitive to the historic structure, but also being sensitive to the owner. The fact that he just went through this fire and this traumatic experience, and he had this building that he bought in this state that has alterations. And how far do we really want to go in telling them that he needs to remove all of these? So we're continuing to work on the project right now. They're evaluating some of the historic detailing on the porch in an effort to replace some of those features as well. Apparently there's a lot of structural damage that they need to address as well. But we'll be continuing to work with the owner and trying to encourage him to restore as much as possible, but also being sensitive to the actual nature of the restoration as well.
Yeah, I can add some things about, with regard to the standards, there's a few things about this building that have really always bugged me. And so I went back to the memo that I wrote in 2013 or something like that, and kind of pulled out some of that information to try to hopefully help guide the rehabilitation towards getting rid of some of the things that we thought were really cluttering up the front of the house. For example, Christy talked about that balustrade where you've got the double balustrade on top, where it's really just that lower one that was meant to be up there. And so their solution for how to make it a habitable porch was to just put more balustrade on top of it. And then another architect at some point had suggested, well, maybe you should take all that off and build one tall balustrade instead of the two. I said, no, because that doesn't meet the standards, because you can't remove the original material and give the impression that there was always a tall balustrade there. That didn't work per the standards. So my suggestion was to remove the top part of the balustrade, which is not original, and to put either a glass railing behind it of the proper height, or you could even have just a metal railing that was very spare behind it in some way, so that you could still achieve the height that you needed for safety purposes, but that you wouldn't have all this railing on railing effect. The other main thing was the enclosure of the porch. So you want to use the porch as a dining space that is not open to the elements, even though it was originally all open. Oops, sorry. Go the other way. Can you go back to the historic photo, maybe? Yeah, so you can see how open that porch was. And now there's sort of an intermediate pier in there between the two columns, halfway on each of those front bays. And then it's enclosed with multi-light windows. So they thought multi-light windows are sort of in keeping with this period. And so they thought that they'd done a good thing. This is before the current owner, by putting in something that was kind of the style that as they saw it. But what that did was it put this grid of all the muntins like out at the front surface of that porch. And so in that plane just ended up reading as a solid right across the front of the porch instead of the voids that it should have been originally. So those long sort of low balustrades are gone, but we had suggested again, if they would do something more spare, like almost kind of like some kind of glass frameless enclosure, then it, at least, especially at night, it would give that impression of the open porch and make it more visible. And then also when you were in the porch, you would look out onto the garden as if you were actually on a porch. So these are some of the sort of suggestions that we gave them about how to sort of back up on some of the decisions that have been made by prior owners, still achieve the same function, but just rethink the design for how to make it more compatible with preserving the 1909 appearance of the house.
Okay, so usually in these sort of discussions, we also turn it over to the audience, and we let you be the judge, and you would do differently about the project, what you think didn't meet the standards. Are there any comments from the audience? Oh, I can bring a mic to you as well. Thank you.
May I start with a question? Sort of a context for decisions. Is there an identified date or period of significance that helps to inform the work that's done going forward?
This, not specifically, but there's really just sort of two layers of alterations on this house. There's the original house, and then there's these things that kind of, in my opinion, cluttered it up. There's also a kitchen on the back, which is, I can't even remember what the date of that is, but that happened in conjunction with it being converted. So the idea was to try to take it, to get rid of the things that were interfering with its interpretation as a 1909 house. So, because it was architecturally significant, we took the date of construction as the period of significance, 1909, and tried to encourage them to have whatever adaptations they put on it not interfere with the 1909 appearance. So it's obviously not a restoration in any way, but to make it a rehabilitation that'll be more sympathetic to that original construction date, which is the period of significance, essentially.
What I'm hearing is that its reuse and adaptation as a restaurant does not contribute to its significance.
No, it does not. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question too, actually. I'm assuming you were kind of focused on particularly the areas that had been fire damaged in terms of the rehabilitation, but I'm wondering if you've had any conversation with the restaurant owner about the site as well, because it seems to me that the kind of front lawn aspect has been very altered too, and if there's any room to change a little bit of that while you're talking with him about the building itself.
It's a little bit delicate because I've been, like I said, I've been like complaining about this property for a really long time, and this is a really politically sensitive issue with the city because this owner is really beloved in the city, has a very strong personality, he gets a lot of publicity, and he does an extraordinary amount of very generous charitable work. So nobody wants to interfere with that. And I've been trying to sort of separate out that aspect of his operation from the way that the building is treated. And so to me, like, when it says in your preservation plan that Mills Act houses can't have AstroTurf in front of them, to me, that should apply to everybody. But he's been given certain leeway because of his prominence and the prominence of, the charitable works that are so significant. So there's a lot of things on here that we kind of, there's another diagram that goes with this one that points out things that we suggested might want to be rethought, and one of them was that tile that's everywhere, and the other was the AstroTurf. Another is there's a sort of a like a screen of columns out at the street that's new, And in terms of like that banquet hall that was built on the front lawn, you know, all I can do is frown at it. There's really nothing I can do.
I think that since a lot of that was also damaged with the fire, we're taking that as an opportunity just to give him some, gently recommend things to him that when he does rebuild it, it would be more historically appropriate, and give him some options. So, when he is going to have to rebuild quite a bit of the facade, and the landscaping is going to have to be redone. And so we have been working with him to try to find a way for him to be able to use the space the way he wants to, but also do it in a more historically sensitive way.
I mean,
And then another thing that we've also been thinking about too is, and we have given some recommendations, but obviously not as extensively as the interior. In Anaheim, we really only look at the exterior features, and we've been focusing on restoring those. But the interior obviously as well was damaged. And there's also this sort of fine line of how you want to rebuild that interior in order to keep it historically appropriate. And the owner also wants to maintain the ability to use the California Historic Building Code. So how to be able to keep that while making a few adjustments that he would like to make. We've been trying to work that out too.
I should clarify that ARG's role in this was not as a consultant to the owner, but as our regular role as a consultant to the city of Anaheim. So the things that we're able to recommend are really just kind of suggestions. And my hope in terms of the landscape was that he would get hooked up with a good designer, and that the designer would say, but you've got to get rid of this AstroTurf, rather than the city having to say that. So that's my hope for the future.
So I'll go ahead and ask a question too. Obviously, the property has a Mills Act contract with the city of Anaheim, and is considered a qualified historic resource, because I guess you're talking about them being able to use the historic building code. I don't know if this is a better question for you or for you, Jennifer. Looking at the property from an outsider's perspective, it's kind of hard to evaluate what the historic integrity of the property really was like prior to the fire. And I was wondering if that was a struggle for you guys as you were kind of evaluating the building, trying to identify character defining features or existing integrity. I mean, if this property did not have a Mills Act contract, would this be one that you would consider to be a historic resource? And if so, why?
Maybe you can go back to the shot of it for the fire. I think I can answer this. Okay, so it's all that clutter that you're probably responding to, if you'll excuse my using that term for the 18th time. Before the fire, we actually knew this property fairly well, because we'd already evaluated it to sort of point out what we would like to see happen differently. So we had the historic photograph, which made it a lot easier. And then we just had our knowledge of like, that balustrade is just wrong, what happened there. And then when we looked at the historic photo, we figured it out pretty quickly. The other thing is, so we already knew the building, and we already knew what the character defining features was, and we knew what the alterations were because we'd put all that down in writing years before. It just so happened. The things have continued to get more complicated just because of the addition of this other building and that kind of thing. But it really, once you look at it, it was pretty easy to see once you're standing there what's historic and what's not. And then, when the fire happened, we told them, look, this is pretty easy because your building is symmetrical and only half of it is burned. So if there's anything you have a question about, just look on the other side of the porch and you've got that exact detail right there. So it actually this looks kind of overwhelming, but it actually wasn't that difficult just because we had historic photos. We had a good look at the parts of the building that weren't burned. Things like that gave us a lot of information.
Before I ask a relevant question, I'm going off track to say that I was deeply affected by the tragic fire in London, And while we're not here to talk about fire life safety, uh, fire life safety code design saves lives and saves buildings. And since this is a fire, it came to mind. Getting into the bricks and mortar nitty gritty, when you're replacing wood species and materials, that can be a real challenge because of cost and availability and schedule. So have you, I know you're not building it, but I know the city's dealing with rebuilding. To what extent have you faced that with the applicant terms and the quality of replacement materials?
I think that's still in discussion. The architect the owner chose to use is not familiar with the Secretary of Interior standards. And as many recommendations that we can give, the city isn't forcing them to do anything that the owner feels uncomfortable with. So that said, we are, evaluating certain standards through the building code and the building department as well in order to try to make sure that the building is safe as possible. But I think a lot of that is still yet to be determined.
I would say that the fire is at least going to give them the opportunity to completely redo the electrical system. And in terms of the replacement parts, we sometimes have the problem where, we tell somebody, okay, for your Mills Act contract, we want you to replace these metal things with a column like it was on that house over there. You can see the exact same column over there. So they go to a catalog and they're like, oh, okay, Tuscan number 38. And then it ends up on the house and we drive by and we go, oh, is it not obvious then that that's not the same as that column over there? So I was concerned about this kind of thing happening here. And the last conversation we had with them on site, it was clear that they were going to get these things milled in wood based on the original pieces that they were going to harvest selected bits of. So we haven't gotten to the, we're not really in a position to interfere to that level like we would if it was our own project. But I at least had the comfort level of knowing that they were going to go to an architectural millwork place and get them properly reproduced. So we didn't, I think in our report, our recommendation, said all those things about the dimension, the size, the exact dimensions, the profile and all that, and the species, the material and the species. But it's going to be up to them to follow that.
Yes, we have had one question, but I'm holding it until this group here has a chance to opine. Okay, so I guess I'll move on to the question from the remote person. The question is, and this doesn't directly relate to this project. In fact, it probably will more relate to the next case example that we go into, is can the interior standards and a historic designation be maintained when a building is deconstructed and moved? So maybe that'll move us into the next example. Okay, who wants to have control of the slides? This is actually a project that I put in from CPF side, so maybe I should.
Okay.
Okay, so, and I'll preface this by saying I'm not an architect. I'm not as esteemed as this panel, and I'm not as familiar as I should be with this project because I did all the research and compilation for this just about 2 days prior to last week, so probably about Thursday of last week. So this example is the Sholey Brothers Candy Factory, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a large factory from the 1920s, 1924, located in San Diego's Warehouse District. It operated until the 1950s. It was later used as offices, artist lofts. In 1982, the building became designated as a San Diego locally listed historic site. I believe it also was a tax credit project, but I could be wrong. In 1999, the Padres entered into an agreement with the local government and also the National Trust and Save Our Heritage organization, which is the advocacy organization. You'll see there in the southern part of the city is where the factory is or was. I think the darker line is where it was, and the outline there was where it was moved. So as part of that agreement, there was a treatment plan that called for the retention and rehabilitation of several historic buildings in that district. They were putting in a ballpark, which is now the Padres Park. The Chalet building was about 100 by 100 foot unreinforced brick building. It weighed about 3 million pounds, and it was moved on its wheels using a complicated system of over 42 hydraulic dollies, and it was probably one of the largest moved buildings in history at the time. And they moved it to this new location. There were a few other things that they had to do to it. The orientation of the building, for one, was maintained, but it was moved at 300 feet. The original steel transom units were refurbished and reinstalled with ribbed glass to simulate missing historic prismatic glass, which you'll see in some later photos. And the moment frame was inserted inside the building, leaving the historic wood trusses and brick walls unaltered, though it wasn't part of the original historic character of the building. It was required for seismic safety. There were long missing signage and shields and garlands, and those were gone in the existing building, but they replicated them and used high density urethane castings to put in new lettering, and those were put back on the building after it was moved. So maybe one benefit of salvaging this building was that one analyst estimated that preserving this building's 3 million pounds of brick saved basically the equivalent of powering 145 homes for a year. So thinking about the embodied energy of this move, and maybe we can talk more about whether or not its move complied with the standards, but that is one benefit of saving it. You'll see some photos here of its move. You'll notice that the brick was originally, or it wasn't originally painted in white, but its historic color was natural brick, but it was eventually painted at some point in its history. So as the building was moved, it was required that the bottom level historic street level facades had to be removed completely, and they were reconstructed in place when the building was completed on its move. So those are the, if you noted earlier, the prismatic glass was replaced with it wasn't an in-kind replacement from my understanding based on the application, but it looks pretty similar to the original glass. Those are some of the reproductions of the signage. The historic signage is there, and the polyurethane reconstructions are there and there. And if you look at these are the moment frames on the interior of the building. For structural reasons, they had to reinforce the buildings. And I think if you go back, you can sort of see for the wall facing sort of piers, you can see how they were able to reinforce the inside here, which it doesn't seem as visible or intrusive, I think, as the ones in the center of the room, because they look, from my sense, to be not visible. And that's a pretty common in some of our design awards applications. One of the most common criticisms, I think, is that people go overboard with structural intervention, and they don't think of ways to kind of retain the historic interior features of the building while still maintaining structural integrity. And they don't think creatively about how to reinforce that URM. But from this, my sense, and I'm not an architect, but it looks like the wall side was sort of clad in brick on the interior just to sort of hide the structural component. So these are some completed photos of the moved building after it was moved. The building was adaptively reused as, I think was considered to be reused as restaurant space. So a very different sort of use as it was historically, but maybe somewhat compatible with the type of space that's here. And you'll notice the Padres factory or Padres Stadium in the background behind the factory. So maybe, and I'm not here to opine or offer insight, but I think the last question sort of pointed towards this, and I'm hoping that I could now turn it over to the panel to talk about moved buildings, implications with the standards, and especially I think it's standard number 1, how that would impact how you interpret the standards.
The relocation of buildings raises at least 2 major issues. First, beyond the issue of standards compliance is eligibility, because the National Register guidance causes us to be very concerned about maintaining eligibility when we move existing buildings. If we take I'm thinking of an example that I won't name, a National Historic Landmark house out of it's a modest house in a modest neighborhood where the history of the street and the neighbors is an important part of the significance and the story of that place, and say, we don't think this is a very good neighborhood, let's move it to a public park, then I say the building has lost a great deal of integrity by changing its setting, not just physically, but sociologically. And you can see by this relocation, and I say by way of excusing myself that I don't like moving buildings, but yes, we do that from time to time. And my excuse, well, we accept the challenge. It's not something you really want to do, if for no other reason than it's a heavy hit on the physical materials of the building. It appears to me that this building lost its first floor, and it was reconstructed very well. The building strengthened. The building is in a different setting. It would be in a different setting whether it were in its original location or in this location. So I think maybe that's not easy to parse. It doesn't help that we also have to say not only has the neighborhood changed around the building, but we've actually moved the building in the neighborhood. So we don't have a lot of things to grab onto when it comes to setting and meaningfulness of the footprint of this building.
I'll go ahead and kind of second the thought that Peyton put out there, that, I mean, when it comes to relocating buildings, it's all about why is that building historically significant in the first place? What are the aspects of integrity of that building that are the most important, or that help tell the story that makes that building not just important based on preservation principles, but to the community that that building is in. So I think that you also have to take that into consideration as well. And I think that in theory, relocation of buildings relocated buildings can maintain their historic integrity and importance to a community, but it really depends on the background on that building. Is it the architecture of this building that's important? Is it the fact that it was Sholey Brothers Candy Factory? Or, I guess knowing the background more on the building and why it was listed to the National Register would be good to know, because then you can really evaluate how big of a hit was doing what they did to this building to its significance.
In Anaheim, we've actually moved quite a few buildings in the past. I think the redevelopment agency has moved about 50 of them. But primarily, if not all of them, were moved as contributors to the historic district from one place in the historic district to another. obviously we don't have those redevelopment funds anymore. So basically in the city's mind, the point isn't very, it's kind of moot because we wouldn't be able to move properties anymore anyway. But I think we would be much more willing to move a contributor within a historic district rather than potentially one of our grove houses outside of the historic districts. Move a grove house to a smaller lot or parcel within a historic district or even somewhere else within the city. And doing that would lose its context and the reason why, and a lot of its significance, basically. It would lose its context more than a contributor located within a district in a similar context. I was going to ask Peyton something though. Would you still consider this building as historic though, even though it's lost much of its context, even though the context has changed around it?
Objectively speaking, the building still has most of its original fabric, and it reads, it conveys the architecture of this building. So I think so, though your and Kelly's more subtle comments I really appreciate, because it's sort of one of those it depends questions when you're judging criteria of significance and integrity. But in terms of material integrity, I say yes, but I was waiting to pick on the foam reproduction of features, which I would expect a reviewer to give me a really hard time with, as opposed to using masonry or cement cast elements, which are more durable, rather than a replacement material. Not to say that a replacement material, and I can't help but remember some of our late great National Park Service reviewers who were speaking of repeatedly damaged terracotta elements on the top of high-rise buildings in downtown San Francisco, where fiberglass was allowed, but that's on the top of a 50-story building, and which is a forgiving situation. I worry about the durability of this type of replacement material as well as the flammability of it.
I guess a clarification question for John is this property still considered to be on the National Register and a contributing structure in San Diego?
I'm not even sure if it was, and I vaguely remember that it was a tax credit project, so it would have to be on the National Register if it was. But if it wasn't a tax credit project, it's still, from our research when the entry was made in, I think it was 2004 or 5, so it was a while ago. It mentioned that it was locally designated, so it may have been later designated on the national level to qualify for the tax credits, but I can't say. Or right, and I'm not even sure if this is part of a district now because it's mainly the Padres Stadium, which is all new construction.
So if it was part of a district, it might have been also individually eligible, and then when they moved it, they could have done the tax credits. I mean, I think that I was driving through the arts district in downtown Los Angeles yesterday and sort of thinking of the same thing about how, I think in a rehabilitation this major, especially since it included the move, it erased a lot of the patina that the building had, and it looks like it just came out of the box. But on the other hand, like if people are going to be using those spaces and living in there, you don't want the windows to be nearly as dingy as they were. But it's like, what's that line between cleaning it up enough to have it look good and function well versus having it look like kind of a new building. In terms of just like we were talking about, this sort of like what would you do differently thing for our panel here, and I mean, to me the biggest change, not having known or seen this building, seems to be the fact that it has this like attractive plaza out in front of it, which is great, but it gives kind of a false sense of what its original setting might have been. Those two doors in the front with these roll-up garage doors kind of give the impression of like a loading bay, even though they're down on the ground, so they can't have been a loading dock. So I find that a little bit confusing. Yeah, I think it's the setting if this to me, this is the key thing with a moved building, is that the setting has to be comparable to the original setting, and for me, as absolutely close as possible. It needs to be close to the original site. So we were working with a college campus recently who wanted to move a building because it was inconveniently located where they wanted to put another building. And so they came up with a few sites around the campus, and finally they said, or we could just move it across the street. And we were like, yeah, do that. I mean, because what's the story of this building? The story of this building is part of the development of that street. And you're already compromising it by moving it to the other side. And right now, when you look at the street, there's college buildings on one side, and there's single family houses on the other that now belong to the college. So it gives the impression that there were only houses on that one side of the street. But when we went back and looked at the Sanborn maps, we saw that there were houses on the other side of the street. It's just that the college had torn them down over time. So to me, that justified the idea that the house could still be meaningful on the other side of the street. It was moved catty corner so that the tower on the corner flipped around ends up still being a tower on a corner. It's just opposite corner. So the tower ends up in the same relationship to the corner. The house ends up being the same relationship to the setback ends up being the same as it is across the street. These are all the important things that we didn't know we were going to do this project. We were just doing it as the environmental review on it. And there was a lot of opposition in town because people didn't want the college starting to build institutional buildings on that side of the street where these houses were. But it was what we did to kind of preemptively evaluate whether it was still going to be eligible on the other side of the street was to say, okay, well, let's say it's already been moved, and we were going to evaluate it now according to looking closely at the criteria and at the criteria considerations for moved properties. And it hit all of those buttons, in terms of it's still in the same setting, essentially. It's still part of this, it's still related to the same buildings. It just has a slightly different relationship because it's across the street. And the significance of that person who was very tied to the early days of that college, her proximity to the campus is still clear. So it even though I understood why people were objecting, it was really hard for me to say objectively, no, I'm sorry, this isn't right. I mean, yeah, we wish you wouldn't do it, but if I have to actually do this in a technical manner and go through all these things that would be the criteria for deciding whether the move had obviated its eligibility, I couldn't really say that would happen. So they managed to find a site that was appropriate. They treated the landscape appropriately. The relationships were still very similar. And then they were going to put out something that said that it had been moved. We talked about this earlier about how, making things clear about like what's happened to a building. So anyway, it can be done correctly, but it's hard to get the circumstances right.
I was going to mention, similar to Jennifer, the kind of treatment of that ground floor. How it seems like there was a little bit more of an attempt at a kind of restoration of the two bays on the right. And then as you get farther left into those three bays, it's much looser. I kind of share some of the questions about those roll-up doors, what look like roll-up doors now opening onto a plaza. Would they have been part of a loading dock if they were there historically, or even opening onto a street? And then even as you get a little bit farther, the farthest bay to the left, it looks to me like there's a pretty contemporary, like aluminum storefront recessed back in that corner that's probably trying to tie into the tower that's behind the building. But it looks to me like there's a lot of change that happened to that corner particularly.
Oh, yes, here, I'll bring the...
Oh, yeah, let's go back and look at that.
Can you mention that?
The question was just because there's been a lot of discussion about this loading dock. If you went back to that slide.
Oh, yeah, right, and I do recall this. Yeah, so it was historically an entrance for delivery trucks, from what we can tell. The historic, maybe I have the remote. So look at the, what more I think. Oh, there it is. But what I believe what the design awards application mentioned was that the materials used for those doors were not what they originally used. Of course, I mean, those are contemporary doors. You wouldn't, if you were a factory, you wouldn't, make them glass like that. So that was more, I guess you would say, conjectural, or just an architect having fun with it. So those were historically there. It just wasn't the materials that they used for those doors.
At the very least, I would want those to be painted green, because it's
Right.
clear that they're not the original doors, so it's not like you're presenting them as something, falsely original, but it just doesn't blend very well.
I'm going to,
I have a comment.
yes.
So a couple of years ago, the California Preservation Foundation had their annual meeting in San Diego, and I went on the walking tour, and we went to this building with the architect that did it. And I can't remember all the details, but a couple of salient points that I think. First of all, they moved it one block. So there used to be a street grid here, and they moved it just one block in the same orientation, just kind of slid over. The other thing that I remember is that this area of the city once all had this kind of 2- and 3-story warehouse buildings, and they're almost all gone. So this is one of the very last of its type. The other one actually got absorbed into the structure of the Padres Stadium, and it's the Padres shop on the ground floor, and it's very interesting. But I think that was the significance, that it's one of the last of this type. And now, instead of being in an abandoned area of the city, it's a vibrant restaurant. And that plaza that you call a plaza is actually a street that's been closed off. So it once used to be a street. But so now, instead of being this abandoned building, it's a vibrant part of the Padres complex. I think there's a lot of merits to all of that.
Inside, as you walk, sir, through it, as you were walking through it, on the bottom floor of the new restoration or refurbished or whatever you want to call it, of the candy factory, do they have any photographs such as this one indicating what it looked like? Because I'd like to see more of that done, where if you have something that has been changed, whatever it is, that you have the old-time photo that kind of gives you a trip back to history as to the vehicles in front, what they used, anything like that. And it gives you a sense of appreciation of the past and the future.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I'll also add, if they wanted to be completely accurate historically to what this building was, is if this photo is from within the period of significance, they would have reconstructed that fire escape. But I'm sure there's a lot of code issues with that and various reasons they didn't. Maybe Peyton can weigh in on that.
We often have a condition of approval. I won't call it mitigation, because we don't do any projects that have significant impacts on historic resources. But often a condition of approval is some interpretive material, which is fantastic. And, durable, displayed on the outside, displayed on the inside. Not to say that it undoes or brings back missing things, but it helps to remember, it helps to preserve, and people enjoy it. Any of our city staff people have experience with that sort of interpretation?
We don't have a whole lot of moved buildings that are similar in scale to this. I will say in Orange, the majority of buildings that we move around are like little accessory structures or garages that contribute to the historic district as a whole, but maybe just shift back slightly on a single family residential property. So there's not a lot of need for interpretation in those cases, though. I think if we were looking at a project that potentially had an impact on a historic resource, we would ask for those kinds of mitigation measures.
Actually, a comment. Can you go back to the most recent front facade? Oh. Yeah, you could have gone out. So right there,
No, they did.
Somewhat,
Yes,
yeah.
with the ladders, little balconies. Yeah.
So
Actually, good use.
my gym is just maybe 100 feet away from that. I stare at that building, and I was there when they moved it in there. One comment that I had as a preservationist, I was going to lobby, and I didn't do it. I'm kind of regretting that I didn't. That they should put at least a gas lamps instead of these kind of futuristic Dr. Zeus type lampposts. To kind of maybe just those two maybe changed to make it so it's part of the building. That's all I have.
Yeah, I actually I agree with that comment. I think it would have been nice, since this is no longer a true vehicular path, that it might have been nice to make some reference to the sidewalk and the parkway that was there historically, so that those roll-up doors start to make a little bit more sense in relation to what was historically actually a street.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you can't put a curb in the middle of the plaza, but clearly there's lots of things you could do with the paving, changes in the paving to sort of give a sense of where the street was and where the driveways were. There's lots of things they could have done to kind of push that a little farther.
Okay, so did you have something to say, Peyton?
Quickly, jumping back to moving buildings. Another case in point, the Decker House in Pasadena is a Victorian vernacular. It will be moved from its existing lot to become part of a multifamily project. And this is one of those cases where that has taught me that it's better not to have hard and fast rules. If the building were maintained on its original foundations, objectively, that's the right best thing to do. However, it's an existing property now looks like a war zone for about a block because everything else is gone and everything new around it is light industrial and office. It's moving to a residential neighborhood on the same side of the street, same orientation, with street trees. And emotionally, I think this house would be much happier.
I totally agree. I looked on Street View to see where it was being moved to, and when I saw the site, I went, it just looks like it'll be so much happier there.
And not to close this discussion because we can continue it. I think the broader discussion, which is really important all the time, is when we are not restoring but rehabbing missing storefronts and windows and adapting uses. What do we do? And what is the neighborhood, the regulatory context? How far can we go? When I had SHPO National Park Service agree with my client that missing storefronts in a Chigga-Rigga-esque building could be replaced with butt glazing, floor to ceiling, because it's modern and differentiated. I was a little bit shocked, but the local design commission didn't let that happen anyway. So you're also sometimes negotiating between different levels of review. I'm done.
And one final comment or question that came from I'm going to have to stand behind that. That came from the audience online was, would it change if this building was completely deconstructed? All those bricks were taken apart and it wasn't a moved building. And they moved all those bricks back to the same place and stacked the bricks back in the same configuration and basically a full reconstruction essentially. And does that move it from being a rehabilitation to a reconstruction, even though they use the original bricks and everything?
You mean in concept or in terms of like the code and all that?
So I guess I'm fearless today. That's not a reconstruction because I missed your presentation, Jennifer, but a reconstruction is building a missing building. I think that deconstructing a building into a pile of bricks does not retain adequate integrity to maintain eligibility or meet the standards.
I'd second that.
Okay, and with that, we'll move on to the next one.
Not mentioning the labor factor.
So with this project, I think I could advance the slides if you'd like, Peyton, but Peyton Hull, if you don't know, is very involved with projects here on Chapman, and he's familiar with a lot of them, and he's most familiar with, among these three examples, with this case example. So maybe you can walk us through this project, and where we're sitting right now, in case you don't know, is the Digital Media Art Center.
We also have two people from the city of Orange who are the reviewers and regulators.
Of course.
So I would don't have any reserve because I'm here. I'll leave the room if necessary. The top photo is an archival photo. That's historical. In the middle is the way the building was found, and at the bottom is the building as Chapman rehabilitated, and you're in it now. So there was reconstruction of missing features at the corner using archival materials. So it was documented. There were missing windows, damaged windows, windows that had been removed and infilled with masonry, and there was a great deal of paint removal. The interior is, as you can see, a warehouse type setting with open skylight monitors. The approach there was to retain the visual connection to a large open space and unfinished roof structure while inserting reversible, removable, non-structural partitions to build rooms within rooms, which is where you are. That was the objective. The only concern that I had about the outcome is that we had and I'm throwing people under the bus who aren't here, is that we were involved early when it was okay, here's the building we have, we're going to do a rehab of this building. We went away, and then I came back and all the paint was gone, and I'm a little bit concerned about the methods that were used to remove the paint. If you look at the surface of the brick, and I'm compelled to bring that up because this is such an important standards compliance issue if you're going forward with your masonry projects, and I'd like to leave it at that.
We did actually looked at some really chewed up brick earlier today.
You being OTPA, who's a really important participant in preservation in Orange.
We go through the review process of really any review of any work done on any historic resource within the district. And this particular building, initially, like the other building that's over on Maple, the wire, also a wire company, they retained a lot of the interior structure, where this building, that was supposed to occur as well, but they found so much toxicity in the soil, they had to remove all the walls and remove most of the soil below us here to clean it up. So in effect, what was left was just the facade, which was the south and east facade. So my question would be, at what point does a building that so much historic fabric has been removed lose its status, its contributing status? So I would want to present that to you, Peyton, because I'm not sure when you entered this particular project, but I'm assuming it was from the beginning. But we had a lot of people complaining in town that what happened, that there's only the facade left.
There, in the beginning, which was before I was present, there was an excellent assessment report written by Chattel Architecture that evaluated the buildings that are on the property. From my perspective, where we came in, most of those buildings were removed, and I have an aerial photo that I can show you when we walk. There you go. So the most of the industrial buildings on the site were demolished. And I think that, well, if you confine your look at the footprint of the building we're sitting in, that its historic walls are intact. The north wall, which was not character defining, was not a significant wall, and the modern wall and the shelter that you see is a contemporary, hopefully compatible addition. But the 500-pound gorilla that's not in the room is the rest of the building that's on the site. And perhaps we're talking about the same thing in different terms.
Thank you. And maybe somebody from the city could talk a little bit about the history of the site and why that northern portion had to be demolished.
So I was not working for the city at this time. The project was originally conceived and constructed, but back actually as far back as 2003, Chapman University, as part of their specific plan, had really identified this area of the historic district where they kind of were, there were warehouses they were buying with plans for future campus expansion to really be kind of a, they envisioned this as kind of almost like a film school kind of insular like colony, almost like a campus that was going to include the film school, which is adjacent to this property, this new kind of digital media arts complex, and also residential for students who were part of the film program. So they kind of called it Filmmakers Village was the idea. That was actually a project that prior to the conception of this the project that we're in right now had gone through a review process with the city and been approved not only to construct something on this property, but also demolish kind of the parts of the building that had been identified as not historically significant. And on this aerial, the giant vacant lot you see at the top there was meant to be where the new student residential was going to be constructed. Unfortunately, because this property is a former wire and cable factory, there is a significant amount of hazardous material contamination on the site. And it wasn't until after the project was approved and the university was in the process of preparing construction documents, they realized they couldn't actually build residential on the site. The amount of vapor extraction remediation required was going to make it impossible in a reasonable time frame to be able to undertake that project. So once they realized that the residential was out of the picture, they had to reconceive how they wanted to reuse this, what could be done on this site, and how they were going to develop it. So whether they would have demolished quite as much of the existing structure as they had they known that that was going to be an issue, I don't know. But that wasn't something they realized until it was too late. So those of us who will be going on the walking tour with Peyton will probably walk by that property, portion of the property. It currently is being redeveloped as tennis courts. The place for the residential was going to be, because they've remediated it enough for tennis courts and locker rooms, but not residential uses. I think the pictures we're going through now are kind of what the inside of the Digital Media Arts Center building looked like today. I think maybe Peyton can talk about that a little bit more.
I'd better get myself out of trouble by saying that the reason we're looking at 14 sites on our death march this afternoon is that Chapman has done so much amazing work. If you look at the totality of retaining buildings, rehabbing buildings, reusing buildings, and you know, I teach, so I'm paid by USC, and we grit our teeth every day of the week over trying to save buildings and trying to prevent now mid-century modern buildings from being rehabbed into oblivious 21st century buildings. So when you have the demands of use and real estate, it is tough. And not to say that the DMAC is a bad project, but there were, as in any campus and district, compromises were made in order to develop a campus. One, under Standard 9, A.C. Martin were the architects here. They are historic architects on the site, and they are architects who are historic. They do interesting design work. That shelter, its first iteration, I thought was beautiful, but a really expressive, what I like to call cattywampus modern. Uh, and we said, why don't you try making it really simple? It's entirely new materials. The siding is clearly not brick, but this, if you make it almost industrial and simple, it will be more compatible with the simplicity of the structure of a warehouse building. And so we think it was successful. That's part of what we're here to talk about. What do you think? Should have been white painted wood and brick with brick piers, or can a new differentiated addition also be very explicitly modern while not being a jarring contrast to the geometry and the material character of the original building? So I think this little piece here, this photo, I love because I thought it, in my mind, it's a little success story among the things that make this an interesting project.
I was going to say from the city side too. So we're looking at the specifics of this site, but we're also looking at compatibility with the historic district as a whole. And this is a case where I think the site plan and the way that the uses and the massing of the building were laid out on the site, separating that from all of the demolition that happened, was actually pretty successful for the historic district. It might help if we got the aerial back. So along the railroad tracks is the greater height of the building with that parking structure. I think it's a 3-level parking structure, maybe. Thank you. That would help, actually. So those are the railroad tracks. This is the parking structure with a little greater mass than the historic building. So from the city standpoint, we're preserving the elevations along that intersection that were really important. We're concentrating the higher and newer parts of the building along the railroad tracks and back from the street off of the site. The approach into the site is still more or less in the same spot. So in those ways, the site plan, I think, was quite successful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think another element that's kind of hard to see in the aerial, as far as talking about concentrating the mass and scale of the building, was that you can see kind of in the photographs prior to the project, there was a very large tower element on the building. That was, I guess, there you can see it there, the corrugated metal tower, I think had something to do with the operation of how they manufactured the cable and the wire. That was, I think, determined under the course of the project that it need to be to be removed. I can't remember if that was for safety reasons or not, but in part of the development of the project moving forward, the university's consultants reconstructed essentially a tower of similar material in the same location. Even though that part of the building is now a parking structure, it really helped preserve how the building is experienced from the street, because you're really seeing the different massing elements of the building as they would have been perceived before. And I think even if that functionality is not there anymore, I think that what it brings to the project and how you see it from the corner is really important in telling you the story of what that building used to be used for.
It still has some patina also.
Yeah.
We didn't want to put silver paint on it and have it bright, shiny new. And I don't program the education here, but I thought it would be a great place to project movies.
So is that tower new or not new?
Kelly?
It's pretty just new.
But yet it's made to look old.
It's made to be in the same location as the old one used to be, so you still kind of perceive it to be the old cable tower.
Reconstructed feature with
Right.
original materials,
Right.
original facing materials.
Yeah.
This building, the non-contributing building adjacent to it with the barrel roof, that was initially going to be residential as well. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. For some reason, the fire department, Orange Fire Department, had a problem with that. So Chapman just didn't go forward with it. But they thought that they wanted to retain that whole barrel structure. It was very unique, and they thought it would make a very pleasing environment for like a lounge area for the students, and then farther back would be the residential. But like I said, the city, for one reason or another, the fire department had issues with that. So
May we go back to the aerial of that area? Yes. So that's a piece of facadism also, because that end of the building is a freestanding supported brick wall that's what's left of the warehouse that's standing in front of a parking structure with obscure glass.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a separate portion of the site that some of you may be familiar with. We might walk by today, right? Maybe we can talk a little bit about this design and what's going on here.
When the building was parsed, as we noted previously, parts of this building were retained. This was a fragment of the masonry building that remained. Had some interesting nicknames because it was an auto repair shop that went by those names. So what we had left when the project was entitled and selective demolition was completed was basically not much more than a wall. So a dressing and shower facility to support the tennis complex was designed around it when it was determined that this site could not become a dormitory site, but instead, at least in the interim, a tennis complex.